Alina Gabriela, mulțumesc. Thank you very much for coming. It was a very generous introduction. I'm going to talk about the topic of Britain and Europe, building on what I talked about yesterday. If you want to see the lecture I gave yesterday, you can see it online. I'm going to talk about four elements. I want to give you some context of Britain's relationship with Europe. I think often in the rest of the continent, people don't really understand the British dilemma. And I think it's healthy when I go around and visit places in Europe, I often get the question, why does Britain have this strange relationship with Europe? And so I think it's important to give you that context. I'll talk a bit about where I think the EU is heading in the current crisis and what the crises, I should say in plural, and what that means for Britain and why that's particularly problematic for the UK and the further development of the EU. Then I'll talk a bit about what David Cameron and the British government and the British policymakers want in terms of this new bargaining situation, whether or not we're going to get it, what it might look like, and then I'll finish off saying a bit about public opinion and where we might go in the referendum and why I think it is going to be very close. And if I had to bet right now, I think it would be very tight, and there's a good chance we could vote to leave, because for mainly domestic parochial reasons, without thinking about the consequences for Europe as a whole. So in terms of the context, one thing you have to think about is British identity. British identity is really a torn between European and an Anglo identity. So in terms of our political values, we are very European. We are, in the World Values Surveys, for example, we are mainstream Europeans. We have very similar views to French or Germans or Scandinavians or most other European countries on things like public spending, healthcare, education, gun control, the death penalty, religion. We're a very secular society, or a post-religious society. So in all these measures, we seem very similar to a lot of other European countries. But then when you ask British people, which countries in the world do you feel closest to? They tell you, United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and, oh yeah, maybe France, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Norway. Long way down actually is France normally, even though it's only 20 miles away across the channel. But the identity is primarily an Anglo-Saxon identity. Our culture is in the English language culture. And if we go back to Churchill, who was a famous advocate of the English language community. He wrote a book that he won the Nobel Prize for Literature for, which was the history of the English-speaking peoples. And his argument was that this was a vision of a post-imperial Britain, no longer the British Empire, but an English language community of the Commonwealth being an economic unit as well as a political unit, distinct from the continent. In 1948, he gave a famous speech in Zurich, and he called for a United States of Europe, but he expected Britain not to be part of this United States of Europe. That's for the rest of you guys, was his view. And this is, in a sense, back now in the British identity. Yes, we are European, but we're not quite European. And it's not just about identity and values where we're split. It's split when it comes to the economy and the structure of our economy and our economic trade patterns. So our basic structure of our economy is a very liberal, open global trading economy, service sector economy, not just financial services, but creative industries, trading not just with Europe, but with the rest of the world. In fact, our trade integration with the rest of the EU is the lowest amongst all the EU member states. So our trade with the EU as a percentage of our total trade is around between 47 and 50% in a given year, just below 50%. And the rest of our trade is with the rest of the world. That's around 20% lower than the average in the EU. It represents about 20% of our GDP. So 80% of our GDP is either domestic or traded globally. And you see in the British debate a real split in their economic interests. You might think, of course, all the economic interests in Britain would want us to stay in the EU. It's not true. The City of London is split. The big banks would like us to stay in the EU. The hedge fund industry want to leave. The hedge fund industry is furious with Brussels. They say 80% of the hedge fund industry in Europe is in London, but it's regulated from Brussels. This would be like the British telling the Germans how to run their car industry, or telling the French how to run their agriculture. Yet the Brussels and the rest of Europe thinks they could tell us how to run our hedge fund industry. So this is and the hedge fund industry is wealthy, and they are bankrolling the campaign to leave, which I'll come back to. Amongst the broader manufacturing or business interests, the large-scale manufacturing interests, the car industry, for example, is very dependent upon the European market, and they want us to stay. But the surveys of the small businesses want us to leave. And these are small businesses not just for domestic consumption, these are small businesses in the service sector, trading globally. And the Institute of Directors represents the small business interest. They just did a survey of their members. Over 70% of their members wanted us to leave. This is very different to the survey of the CBI, the Confederation for British Industry, which is large-scale business, car industry, British Airways, Rolls-Royce, the big manufacturers. They want us to stay. So you can see that the business community, the business interests are really split, and the City of London is split. This then presents Britain with a problem in terms of trying to think about what sort of campaign to run. This is particularly acute given where the EU is heading, which was the next point I was going to talk about, which is in response to the Eurozone crisis, and now probably in response to the migration crisis, there will be pressure for deeper political and economic integration. It started already with the Eurozone crisis. So in response to the Eurozone crisis, the EU has built a new macroeconomic architecture. So it's built the European Stability Mechanism, which is the bailout fund. It's built the Fiscal Compact Treaty, which are the rules governing borrowing and balanced budgets. It's built the Euro Plus Pact, which is a pact for harmonising national macroeconomic policies. And it's built the European Banking Union, which is the rules governing regulation of banks. The UK is not part of any of this new infrastructure. So the UK is the only member state that's not part of any of this new infrastructure. The UK is also, of course, not part of Schengen. The UK has got an opt-out from Justice and Home Affairs, and the UK has an opt-out from the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights. So all of the major institutions in Europe that have been built post the creation of the single market, the UK is not part of. So Nigel Lawson, a former British Chancellor of the Exchequer under Margaret Thatcher, wrote an article in the Times in 2012, and he said, with the way the EU is heading, the choice for Britain is whether to be isolated inside Europe or isolated outside Europe. And you might say that's Britain's choice to be marginalised, but he often talks about the following analogy. Imagine that on a Tuesday in Brussels, there's a meeting of the ECOFIN Finance Council, the Council of Economic and Finance Ministers. And they are going to discuss the financial services regulation, a new directive regulating financial services. And in the morning, there's a meeting of Eurozone finance ministers. And the Eurozone finance ministers are talking about how they fix the euro. And so they meet in the morning, and then they have lunch, and they promise they're not going to talk about the Financial Services Directive. And then you come to the meeting of in the afternoon of the ECOFIN, EU Council, and the presidency says, well, who's in favour of this directive? And all the Eurozone finance ministers put their hand up, and they have a qualified majority, and the UK goes, wait a minute, how did that happen? And now there's pressure for the Eurozone ministers to meet as the social effects ministers. We heard this from the EU advisor to the president, that this is the pressure now, that there will be a meeting of the social affairs ministers who want to talk about economy, social policies within the Eurozone and so on. So in a sense, there will be an impact of this deeper economic integration within the Eurozone on the collective governance of the single market. And so I'm painting this picture, not because I'm a Eurosceptic, but I'm painting this picture to illustrate to you the dilemma that the British government faces, the same dilemma that either a Conservative government or a Labour government, or whoever it would be in number 10, would be facing exactly the same dilemma. So then in this context, David Cameron made a speech, a Bloomberg speech, where he promised that there would be an in-out referendum, not just a referendum on the treaty, but a vote to decide whether we stay or whether we go. And he said that if he was elected and they won the 2015 election with a majority, which they did by surprise, he would then put a bill to Parliament. So the bill is now going through Parliament for this referendum. The referendum will be held before the end of 2017. There's growing pressure to bring it forward so that it doesn't become part of the French and German election campaigns. So there's discussion that it will probably be in 2016. Now people are saying we don't want it at the end of 2016 because if we have it in October 2016, this will be after the migration. There'll be another migration crisis. There's always a migration crisis in September. Every year. It's always worse in September because people travel. The Mediterranean is flat in September. Nobody whisks taking boats in November or December. So we don't want it, another migration crisis. So maybe we have it in the spring. So we could have the referendum as early as May next year, May or June 2016. The question was in the first draft, the question was, are you in favour of Britain remaining a member of the EU, yes or no? And the Electoral Commission, under pressure from the anti-European campaign, said this is not a fair question because yes is pejoratively more favourable than no. And there's some uncertainty about what no means. And it's not clear. So they recommended to change the question, and it's now been changed in the bills. The question is, are you in favour of Britain remaining a member of the European Union or leaving the European Union? And you choose remain or leave. So we now have a remain campaign and a leave campaign, not a yes campaign and a no campaign. So it's actually clearer with a remain campaign and a leave campaign. And he's now said he's going to ask for a new relationship for Britain, and he talks about 4 areas. Sovereignty, which means he wants more powers for national parliaments in particular, and British opt-out from ever closer union, for a commitment to recognition of the fact that for most British people they see this as primarily economic integration, not political integration. He wants protection for the City of London and protection for British financial services. And he wants reform of migration rules. Initially, his party wanted him to actually allow Britain to restrict the number of EU migrants coming into Britain. But now they realise they're not going to get this, and so they're in favour. He's asking for restricting access to benefits, and particularly access to what we call in-work benefits, payments to people on low incomes, which is not currently legal under EU law for us to withdraw those benefits to EU migrants. The fourth thing he wants a new sort of growth or reform agenda for the single market, particularly liberalisation of services and a transatlantic trade investment partnership, to change the direction Europe is heading in. But he's not going to get any of those things. So he's red cards for national parliaments. He might get a promise that they will revisit this the next time they have treaty reform, and the Dutch and a few others are in favour of this. He might get a protocol attached from some European Council summit that says ever closer union doesn't apply to Britain. And he might get in that protocol it might say something like, when talking about financial services, there'll be a recognition that these are concentrated in one member state, brackets the UK, and that they will endeavour to reach consensus when regulating financial services. They're not going to change the treaties for free movement of people. They're not going to change the 2003 directive on the free movement of people. And there can only be some vague commitment for transatlantic trade agreement, or because Germany's never going to agree right now. There's big opposition to this in Germany. So he's going to come back with very little to show from the negotiations, is the expectation. Maybe a protocol. A lot of people in his party will not be happy with this, and they will push to say that this is not enough, and so there is no real relationship, fundamental change in Britain's status within the EU. And so they will campaign. There's pressure amongst his cabinet colleagues to allow for a free vote amongst the cabinet, so members of his cabinet can actually campaign for Britain to leave the EU. So this comes to then my final point, which is to talk about the state of public opinion right now. So the latest polls, we went through a period in late 2014, early 2015, where the percentage of the public who said they wanted to remain was about 5% ahead of the percentage of the public who said they wanted to leave, with about 20% that were don't knows. And now it's switched. The last 2 weeks of opinion polls have the Leave campaign ahead of the Remain campaign. From YouGov, Comres, Ipsos Mori, all the major pollsters. And the 20% don't knows. My colleague Sarah Holbolt, who's a scholar of EU referendums, would say that on a lot of these referendums, the don't knows will split 2-to-1 for the status quo. So it's an optimistic interpretation. We saw this in the Scottish independence referendum, for example. It was very close up until the last week of the campaign, and then on the day, 55% voted to stay in the UK, 45% voted to leave, and the evidence afterwards was that the don't know split 2-to-1 in favour of stay. So the status quo option. There's a status quo bias in referendums. But I think there's good reason to think that that might not be the case this time. Firstly, what is the status quo? The status quo is highly uncertain. It's not like I'm changing the constitution. I know how the current constitution works. I vote to leave the UK. I know what being in the UK now currently is. So the status quo is hugely uncertain. We don't really know what remaining in the current EU when the EU is changing and Britain's relationship with the EU is changing. What is the status quo? So it's not clear to me that we're going to get that natural 2-to-1 split for the status quo. Secondly, I think we could see very differential turnout for the Remain and Leave sides of the campaign. The evidence suggests people who are willing to vote to leave are far more likely to vote in this referendum than the people who want to vote to remain. The soft, centre-left pro-Europeans could easily stay home. Because the worry is they can see this as David Cameron's referendum. This is a referendum for Cameron, the City of London creative industries, the cultural elites, the Guardian editorship and the Times editorship, and London. The centre-right in London are telling us to vote for this. And if you are lower